The singular critique of Kill la Kill, the one which appears nearly universally when people write their initial or reflexive opinion on the series, is that the show was not nearly as empowering as it holds itself out to be. No matter how much the character like Satsuki tries to justify wearing Junketsu in its synchronized form, she will always be a mere object of male desire. She can be as body positive as she wants, swear to the heavens that she's comfortable with the leering gaze of the student body of Honnoji Academy, and exclaim that her self-worth is independent of what the howling masses value. But none of this matters, because at the end of the day, both the male characters within the world of Kill la Kill, as well as the presumed male otaku audience without, will only ever see the Kamui wearers, Satsuki Kirin and Ryuko Motoi, as objects of male desire. This is a mistake. So let's take a closer look. The third episode of Kill la Kill, Junketsu, is a watershed moment within the entire narrative of the show, as it not only introduces the second Kamui, Junketsu, but also establishes the internal logic of why the Kamui in their synchronized forms are as scanty as they are. It also provides character-based narrative development and sees Ryuko come to terms with having to wear Senketsu in his synchronized form. This is achieved through two bombastic monologues, one provided by Satsuki,
この姿はカムイが最も力を震える姿。それを俗な価値基準で恥じるなど、まさに己の小ささの証明。この桐生に殺き、我が野望成就のためならば、天下に乳房を晒そうと、恥もなければひるみもない。我が行動に一点の曇りなし。
The other by Mako Makanshoku.
リュウコちゃん、あなたはサツキ様に負けてない。あなたのおっぱいはサツキ様より大きい。私見たもん。リュウコちゃん、結構いいおっぱいしてるってうちの家族の間でも評判だもん。だから恥ずかしがらないで一気に脱いじゃえ。
Ryuko, for her part, takes both speeches to heart and, accepting this new reality, is finally able to synchronize with Senketsu and becomes a match for Satsuki. This messaging is, however, not without its critics. The argument is that these justifications do not hold up to critical examination. This is because, despite the stated personal views of the characters as subjects, both the fictional male audience as well as the assumed male viewer still get to leer at these girls dressed in outfits that leave little to the imagination. And this is because of an incredibly pervasive facet of visual media called the male gaze. The concept was first proposed by John Berger in his 1972 documentary and book of the same name, Ways of Seeing. Despite never actually using the phrase, the male gaze, Berger nevertheless wrote about the presumed viewer of the artworks he was examining. One might simplify this by saying, men act and women appear. Men look at women, women watch themselves being looked at. This determines not only most relations between men and women, but also the relation of women to themselves. The surveyor of women in herself is male, the surveyed female. Thus, she turns herself into an object, and most particularly, an object of vision, a sight. The concept was coined and popularized by feminist writer Laura Mulvey in her 1973 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema. Rooted in psychoanalytic analysis, Mulvey made a very compelling case for the default lens of the cinema to be coded as male. In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. Traditionally, the woman displayed has functioned on two levels: an erotic object for the characters within the screen story, and as an erotic object for the spectator within the auditorium, with a shifting tension between the looks of either side of the screen. Mulvey's essay was incredibly impactful, and the influence of the idea of the male gaze on not only cinema, but visual media as a whole, has been profound. Its influence is, I will argue, precisely why critics are able to dismiss the spoken words of the characters and assert that the continued nature of the revealing outfits and cinematography of the series still centers and promotes the male gaze. According to Rianne Torres in her 2018 article, My Fave is Problematic, Kill a Kill, from the audience's point of view, we see both girls put into sexually humiliating situations, like Ryuko's first fights and Satsuki being imprisoned by her mother, and in both cases, the camera frames them for titillation. The show may claim the two are empowered because of the physical strength they receive from Senketsu and Junketsu, but in the end, they're still being objectified by the rest of the people in their universe, and in ours. In these kinds of analyses, the influence of Mulvey is quite clear, and perspectives like Torres are not outliers, as numerous essays of a similar vein make remarkably similar arguments. Building off the established assumption of the male gaze, a reasonably convincing argument can be made which certainly appears to undercut the stated narration. But there's a problem. In a rather ironic fashion, the argument being made is that the male gaze is both necessary and unassailable. The authors become so caught up in their own assertions as foregone conclusions that the idea of using the assumed male gaze as a tool to critique the tendencies in anime, let alone alternative readings, are precluded. The assumption being made is that the writers are centering the assumed male otaku gaze to provide titillation and arousal, but this assumption is contradicted by both the narrative and meta-narrative of the show. As noted in her thesis, The Female Gaze in Contemporary Japanese Literature, Catherine Hemmann argues that the male gaze should not be taken for granted in the study of literary texts and graphic novels, as an awareness of an active female gaze can change the ways in which we understand contemporary Japanese literature and popular culture. Female readers and writers can find and create enjoyment in messages of feminist empowerment even within works with flawed and problematic representations of femininity. The female gaze thus acts as a mode of resistant reading that allows alternative methods of reading, viewing, and interpreting female characters and the gendered themes and issues of a text, regardless of the gender of the creators or the gender of the reader. There is a fundamental aspect that, as far as I have been able to read, goes completely overlooked in the critiques I mentioned above, and that is the role of power. No, not empowerment, but who in the world of Honnoji Academy holds the balance of both systemic and literal power? Well, it's women. Honnoji Academy is ruled by the iron will of Satsuki Kiryan, and the wider world of fashion, the narratives representative for oppressive commercial systems, by the CEO of the fashion conglomerate Revox, Ragyo Kiryan. The four strongest characters in the series are the Kiryans, the Grand Couturier, Nui Harame, and our plucky underdog protagonist, Ryuko Matoi. Certainly, there are strong male characters, 3 of the 4 members of the Elite Four and Nudist Beach's Sumugu, respectively. However, the former operate under the explicit control of Satsuki, and the latter never displays a whiff of any sort of misogynistic sentiment, let alone sexual aggression towards Ryuko, even after he successfully has subdued her and Senketsu. This is significant because the world of Kill la Kill, for all its silliness, plays the respect the protagonists and antagonists have for each other's power straight. This is because there is something in the world of Honnoji Academy which is absent, something that would otherwise lend power and problematize these lusty male gazes. Patriarchy. An exceptionally concise definition of patriarchy is provided by sociologist and feminist writer Gwen Hunnicutt. It means social arrangements that privilege males, where men as a group dominate women as a group, both structurally and ideologically. Hierarchical arrangements that manifest in varieties across history and social space. This power relation, the power relation which problematizes the nature of real-world sexual violence against women, is wholly absent from the hierarchical system present in the world of Kill la Kill. No one ever looks down on Ryuko or Satsuki and dismisses them because they are women. Their being female is never treated as a weakness or a hindrance. Quite the opposite, in fact, as it is usually the leering male characters who are treated as buffoons or as irrelevant, as befalls the characters who are continuously blown away as they are caught up in the maelstrom of fighting between our female protagonist and antagonist. the coding of a character who's supposed to represent femininity, and specifically traditional Japanese femininity, characteristics including docility, shyness, and submissiveness, are utterly lacking in the main cast of female characters, while at the same time, to then posit they are coded as male would be incredibly difficult, owing to the sheer signification of the accentuation of their bodies as exemplifying the female form. In fact, what is happening is that the presumed male gaze is being problematized, and through this problematization, interrogated and challenged. I discussed in a previous video how good If Only I Had Thorns Like a Thistle was as a first episode, and this is even more apparent when you consider the significance of Ryuko's first real fight in the show, against the boxer Takaharu Fukuroda. When Ryuko first encounters him, she remarks how inappropriate his uniform is, to which he replies that for a boxer, the proper uniform is gloves and trunks. Later on, when Ryuko confronts him wearing the semi-synchronized senketsu, he remarks that her outfit is inappropriate, and she is obviously trying to mock him. However, once he realizes that Ryuko is a legitimate threat, he himself reveals his uniform's true form, but is nevertheless defeated. Right at the outset of the show, then, the hypocrisy involved in this series of encounters is laid bare. A male student is able to wear what amounts to underwear and no one bats an eye, but a female student wearing a revealing outfit is scandalized. It is an incredibly basic point, but because of the prevalence of the male gaze, the female body is held to necessarily be sexual, whereas the male body is not. And yet, when you take into consideration the conclusion of episode 3, there is significantly less jeering from the otaku crowds directed towards Ryuko as the series progresses, the last noticeable instance occurring during her fight with Gamaguri in episode 9. In what may be the most overt example of male characters sexually harassing a female character, the behavior of the male members of the Mankanshoku household peeping on Ryuko as she is trying to change, have a bath, or has her pajamas pulled down, is treated as a running gag throughout the episodes that they occur in. In a real-world setting, this of course would be incredibly problematic, because the majority of sexual assaults occur within the context of domestic environments. Yet, because none of these characters are able to enact any sort of coercive force over Ryuko, it can be played off as ultimately harmless. Even then, the show also enacts physical punishment on these leering male characters as the punchline to the gags, and never Ryuko's embarrassment. This is because, despite the criticism of female objectification leveled against Kill la Kill, the female characters are treated not as objects, but as subjects. They are the agents of change and plot progression. They possess both institutional and literal power. The presumed male viewer is also rendered, at best, an afterthought, and at worst, figuratively impotent. The female characters are able to act in precisely the same fashion as their male shonen contemporaries, displaying their bodies not as signifiers of male desire, but as signifiers of power. Returning to Mulvey. The alternative, to the male gaze, is the thrill that comes from leaving the past behind without simply rejecting it, transcending outworn repressive forms, and daring to break with normal, pleasurable expectations in order to conceive a new language of desire. The combination of the stated narrative motivations and perspectives of the characters, the diegetic basis for the appearances of the kamui in their synchronized forms, and the subversive and satirical interpretation of both magical girl and shonen tendencies come together to produce a very strong message which undercuts the prescriptivist essentializing of the male gaze, and instead allows for a creative and ultimately playful critique of long-held assumptions about the dominance of the male viewer, which in Kill la Kill is supplanted by the subjectivity of the female character.